human adventure is just beginning.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Cinemologists. I've said it before, but I'm a huge fan of Star Trek. The original series, Next Generation, especially the first 6 original crew movies. But every time I revisit the franchise, there's one film that keeps pulling me back. It's the film that brought the franchise to the big screen in a big way. So big, in fact, that I need to team up to review it. Yeah!
Okay, imagine you've been a fan of Star Trek since it first aired in 1966. You were appalled that it got cancelled before the Enterprise could complete its 5-year mission, and for 10 years you've read books and articles about Star Trek, caught reruns, remember, no home video or Netflix, hopefully been able to find other fans, possibly catch wind of potential new starts to the series, and now finally, a motion picture for the big screen is being made with all of the original cast and being directed by Robert Wise, who gave us the sci-fi classic The Day the Earth Stood Still. Needless to say, excitement ran very high.
It's almost unthinkable, especially at the time of its original airing, that Star Trek would get this treatment. The series that existed for only 3 seasons was almost cancelled early on, but saved thanks to a letter-writing campaign. However, by season 3 in 1969, NBC basically put the show in a bad slot, dooming it to eventual cancellation. It was only after syndicated reruns that the fan base flourished and paved the way for a motion picture to be made. Gene Roddenberry was originally tapped to write an idea for a Star Trek movie. The first concept developed was basically a glorified version of the episode The Changeling. However, some ideas would see through to fruition, like a new Enterprise. One idea proposed by the writers of Don't Look Now was called Planet of the Titans, in which the Enterprise crew discover a dead planet once home to the ancient Greek Olympians. In this proposed version, they would travel back in time and coincidentally cause man's development, thus becoming gods themselves. Stepping up to direct was Philip Kaufman, who would go on to do the stellar remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He had in mind a more adult kind of Trek. Beginning design work were Ken Adam and Ralph McQuarrie. However, things went sour with the writers, who became fed up with the indecisive Paramount executives. When that project fell apart, things switched back to television with Star Trek Phase 2 for Paramount's own unrealized TV channel. However, it was a certain script for this abandoned TV show and the character of Lieutenant Ilea which ultimately made it to the big screen.
Thrusters ahead, Mr. Sir. Take us out.
The film shoot was a titanic mess, with director Robert Wise struggling to keep the film on schedule and production costs mounting by the hour. According to Wise and William Shatner, rewrites were a daily occurrence, and the film's momentous number of sets, costumes, and props, many of which only appeared on screen for a few moments, in addition to numerous delays in production, sent the film's budget through the roof, higher than Star Wars, higher than Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and adjusted for inflation, higher than 2001: A Space Odyssey. In other words, things were getting a tad out of hand.
The most lauded aspect of the film has always been the visuals. Paramount initially put the task of creating the special effects to the Able organization, which had experience in commercials. However, it soon became apparent that they would not be able to complete the work anywhere near on time, and Douglas Trumbull was brought in as a consultant. Yet things still lagged, and Able was removed and Trumbull's team was brought in. One of the chief things they corrected was a sequence in which Kirk goes after Spock in a spacesuit and gets attacked by V'ger antibodies. He's rescued by Spock, and they explore more of V'ger's interior. The shooting for the sequence had been dragging, not to mention costing a lot, so Trumbull suggested the shortened trip Spock takes as seen in the film. For the awe-inspiring cloud shots, they used various forms of backlit and airbrushed artwork, layering hundreds of exposures to create a sense of volume and depth. John Dykstra's Apogee Studio was brought on board and did some of the secondary spacecraft, such as the Klingon warships and the Epsilon 9 space station, as well as photon torpedoes and the V'ger exterior. Trumbull typically prefers to shoot on 65mm, since any multiple exposures will degrade the film to the point where it will still cut well with the rest of the 35mm footage.
So when you degrade that optical, when you add imagery together on a large format, you do lose quality, but if you start with a large format, that quality cuts more easily with the original.
V'ger was something that required a great deal of design and effects work in and of itself. Sid Mead eventually designed the final look of V'ger, and it was done so the viewer would unconsciously see faces in the textures of its surface. Inside, the miniature room was filled with smoke to add aerial perspective, a trick utilized by Trumbull first on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The orifice was a complex arrangement of cones which rotated, opening and closing like an iris, giving the impression of being organic. Since there had been plenty of exploding models in Star Wars, it was decided that these ships were to be digitized and stored by V'ger, an effect which used a Tesla coil. For the wormhole, a laser hooked up to an audio synthesizer was photographed with long exposures to generate a three-dimensional waving tunnel form. The interior distortion effects on the Enterprise were achieved over 7 months, matting off areas of the frame and stretching areas using long exposures. This is similar to what Trumbull used on 2001 for the Stargate sequence. Similarly, the effect was used for the Enterprise entering warp. It was a race to complete the effects, as well as the rest of the post-production, and while some shots of V'ger were being photographed, the rest of the crew was behind a curtain building the rest of the model. This was at the beginning of the new era in effects started by Dykstra and his crew on Star Wars, the age of precise repetition, which, as Trumbull says, is the key to effects of that time.
Between the shoot ending up behind schedule and the hirings and firings within the special effects department, the film's post-production flew by like a rocket sled to make its premiere on December 6, 1979, and it's an oft-repeated tale in Star Trek lore that director Robert Wise completed the final edit less than a day before its Washington, D.C. premiere, at which prints were loaded into the projector still dripping wet. And what a film audiences were greeted with. The story concerns a dangerous, terribly powerful energy cloud of unknown origin heading directly for Earth. Captain Kirk is now Admiral Kirk, and he's called upon to reassemble the Enterprise's crew and take the craft where no man has gone before, into the mysterious depths of the cloud to hopefully save the human race from annihilation. When initial reviews came out, it seemed like the movie couldn't win. Critics either contrasted the movie's pacing and style negatively with the action-packed space opera Star Wars, or those who could remember that far back compared the movie negatively and called it a pale imitation to Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey due to its extended special effects sequences. Still other critics felt that the film couldn't be taken seriously due to its origin in an iconic 1960s television series. However, there still were some supporters, among them Roger Ebert, who praised the film's deeper intentions and filmmaking craft.
Fan reaction was also decidedly mixed. Some criticized it for the slow pace, others lambasted the movie for not containing more action scenes or a greater sense of fun, feeling that the movie had been too influenced by the serious, thought-provoking science fiction of the 1970s, which is ironic because Star Trek was a major force behind that movement's origin, along with Planet of the Apes and 2001. Still more fans were disappointed by the lack of witty banter and fun interactions between the characters, disliking the idea that the main cast had grown apart since the series aired. The AV Club even jokingly complained that the movie contained an overture. At least I hope that was a joke.
In fact, this film, along with the pulpy and exciting search for Spock and the shoddy but occasionally interesting Final Frontier, inspired the widely circulated belief that the even-numbered Star Trek films are the only worthwhile entries, while the odd-numbered Star Trek movies are bad. It's interesting though, because for years I didn't realize that anyone disliked the motion picture. A lot of my friends are big Star Trek fans, and just about all of them considered it as one of the best entries, if not the very best. It wasn't until I started going on internet forums and Star Trek fan sites that I discovered that some people didn't care much for the film. But whatever the popular consensus, I strongly suggest that you don't let a fan theory about the parity of integers dissuade you from checking out all the Star Trek movies and deciding for yourself which ones you enjoy the most. Regardless of which ones are the best or worst films in the series, there's a lot to be enjoyed in all of them. And you know what's funny? Whenever I hear people complaining about how slow the movie is, I can't help but smile. Not because it isn't slowly paced, there's no denying that, but instead because my initial reaction to the movie was so different. I was about 6 years old when I watched it for the first time. It was past my bedtime, and my dad and I made popcorn and put in the extended edition VHS, which was 12 minutes longer than the theatrical versions. It even advertised that fact on the box. I was familiar with the Star Trek characters from the original series and TNG, which I had been introduced to practically from birth, so seeing them in a movie was definitely a big deal for little me, and over the next 2.5 hours, I was transported to another place. I kid you not, my eyes were totally glued to the TV for the entire runtime of the movie, and I had a cinematic experience unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It was a great childhood moment that my dad and I spent together, and it helped to solidify my love for movies in general. For the first time, I really became aware that movies had the power to take you somewhere else. When I was watching the movie, I wasn't in boring American suburbia. I was in a weird space cloud with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, discovering the mysteries of the cosmos alongside them, and the film's pacing and use of special effects really made me feel as if I were part of the Enterprise crew, going out to intercept the V'ger cloud in a last, desperate attempt to save the Earth from total destruction. So yeah, it was pretty amazing. So what was your first experience with Star Trek, the motion picture?
Well, when I first saw it, I had been familiar with Next Generation, and I was kind of a fan of that. One day when I was 7 or 8, I was at my grandparents' house, and my aunt had the VHS box set of the original 5 Star Trek films. I said I wanted to watch one, and so my grandmother put on the first movie. Except the tape was in the middle of the film, so the first image I saw was of Ilea's tricorder falling to the floor. Once I watched the film, I was enthralled and immediately loved Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Being obsessed with deep-sea life at the time, I was totally captivated with the voyage through the cloud, equating it to traveling down to the depths of the ocean. The ideas thrown around in the film didn't so much confuse my 8-year-old self as intrigue it. Not to mention I loved the soundtrack immensely, and it was one of the first soundtracks I ever got, which I'd listened to while reading my uncle's copies of the Terran Trade Authority books. From there, the original crew became my preferred cast, and Star Trek the Motion Picture is now one of my favorite science fiction movies.
It just goes to show that children really can be the best audiences sometimes, because they go into movies without any preconceptions as to what a film should or shouldn't be. When I watched Star Trek the Motion Picture, I didn't have any expectations about a fast-paced action movie in space. Instead, I came to it fresh and was blown away by the memorable characters and overwhelming sense of cosmic adventure, and of course the amazing soundtrack. In fact, the next day after I watched the movie, I pulled out my officially licensed Iron Mic tape recorder from Toy Story and held the mic up to the TV speakers while the movie played, just so I could listen to the soundtrack while riding in the car. Going back to the extended outer space sequences, the motion picture has invited many comparisons with Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and usually not positive ones. As we mentioned before, the movie's quite frequently blasted for being slow and boring, with one particularly clever critic going so far as to dub it Star Trek the Motionless Picture.
Star Trek the Motion Picture is so boring. Would you shoot a Klingon or do something, man? This is boring. Would you shoot a Klingon or do something, man? This is boring. Would you shoot a Klingon or do something, man? This is boring.
While it is true that the film is slow-paced, I believe that, much like 2001: A Space Odyssey, there's a deeper purpose behind the extended outer space sequences in Star Trek the Motion Picture, besides simply showing off the exceptional special effects, of course. One thing that haunts the movie throughout its entire runtime is the conflict between logic and humanity. This is most obviously manifested through Spock, who's given a great amount of growth over the movie's runtime. At the beginning of the movie, Spock's ready to purge all of his emotions in the Vulcan ritual of Kolinar, but upon sensing the presence of the mysterious space cloud, his hidden emotions drive him to uncover the mystery. After taking this bold step, he joins the Enterprise and discovers V'ger, a being consisting of total logic. It's here that Spock sees the limitations that logic has without emotion, and it's only through the human element that knowledge finds purpose. It's quite a beautiful story, actually, appropriating heavy sci-fi concepts wrapped up in a well-told and effective character piece. And this is where the outer space sequences work so well, I think. In 2001, Kubrick used the cosmos to show how cold and mechanical humanity has become in the future, depicting a human race in need of change. Heck, we even find ourselves identifying more with a computer than we do with any of the characters. Star Trek the Motion Picture borrows the same technique to achieve the exact opposite purpose, contrasting outer space and the machine world of V'ger with the warmth of human friendship.
Well, so help me, I'm actually pleased to see you.
And it's all part of Spock's journey in coming to terms with his half-human nature. This dangerously optimistic view of the human race is rarely shown in science fiction, but that was the way Gene Roddenberry viewed the future, mankind putting aside prejudice and strife to join together and enter into a larger universe. And it's a major element of what makes Star Trek unique among other sci-fi franchises. Am I saying that Star Trek the Motion Picture is necessarily on the same level as 2001: A Space Odyssey? No, not at all. But what I am saying is that it's really a shame that Star Trek gets overlooked for its artistic merit just because it's based off of a cult TV series. If there's one thing that does undercut the impact of these moments, however, it's the, at times, monotonous cutting. The editing always feels the need to go from a breathtaking exterior shot to a close-up of a character reacting, and then this technique is repeated again and again until the scene is finished. I think it's this flaw in the editing, more so than the length of the outer space sequences, that turns some people off to the film. Despite this, I still think the movie has a palpable sense of cosmic majesty and mystery, and the extended nature of these scenes gives Jerry Goldsmith an unprecedented opportunity to make some of the greatest music ever written for the screen, which we'll touch on more later.
The film is also a very poignant and almost melancholy follow-up to the series in a way. As Joel said before, Roddenberry's vision was boldly optimistic, embracing the idea that we had solved our problems and were going out to discover and colonize the universe together, with the Enterprise heading out on a 5-year mission to make that happen. However, when we joined the Enterprise crew years later, the result is a sad one. The 5-year mission has run its course, and all is still not right with the universe. The quest for knowledge and diplomacy did not end with everyone's problems being solved. Kirk got a promotion, seemingly a great thing, but it robbed him of his sense of purpose and the only command he ever really wanted. Spock went back to Vulcan, desperately seeking answers to questions that are common to everyone, even after all that he had seen and done as a Starfleet officer. And McCoy, a faithful officer who always put people first, has completely turned his back on Starfleet, and it's implied that his views on the Federation and his time there have soured since the series ended.
In short, everybody's got problems, and as the story unfolds, each of these circumstances is addressed and paid off in a satisfying way that relates to the central conflict of logic versus human emotion, which is represented perfectly in the relationship between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Spock is the logical alien, McCoy is the emotional, empathetic conscience, and Kirk is the heroic leader that mediates between the two. The film steps it up a notch from the show by depicting this dynamic on an even more cosmic scale, and it presents a problem which our heroes are perfectly suited to solve, and ultimately it reminds them, and us, why they were so good at what they did to begin with.
And a lot of foolish human emotions, right, Mr. Spock?
Quite true, Doctor. Unfortunately, it will have to deal with them as well.
No movie is properly finished without a memorable score. It can elevate the film's place in one's mind from being merely enjoyable to exceptionally indelible and rewatchable. Jerry Goldsmith's score for Star Trek the Motion Picture certainly has the latter quality in spades. Goldsmith was already well practiced in scoring science fiction films, from Planet of the Apes to Logan's Run. These demonstrated his enormous creativity and deftness at orchestration. Because of the motion picture's production difficulties, Jerry Goldsmith had an inordinate amount of time to write the score, taking several months. Most of this was due to the fact that a lot of the visual effects sequences were incomplete because of the difficulties mentioned earlier. Several of the cues he had done already had to be completely rewritten when Robert Wise pointed out that there wasn't really any Star Trek theme in place. As the film was being re-edited, Fred Steiner was brought in to rewrite certain cues. As was typical for Goldsmith, he employed some very unconventional instrumentation. None was more sensational than the blaster beam. Invented by Craig Huxley, this was an electronic instrument, laid out in similar fashion to a giant guitar and struck by empty artillery shells. In this film, it is utilized to represent the V'ger entity. Especially potent is its use in Spock's introductory scene, where he almost completes the Vulcan purging of emotions when he senses V'ger's presence from across space. This isn't a detail Spock reveals by saying, "I sense a presence," but merely communicated through the interjection of the beam. Some other synthesizers are present as well to add more aural texture, which the soundtrack very much needed since most of the sound effects were not completed for the initial release. These instruments played alongside a 100-piece orchestra. Goldsmith's score is rich in leitmotifs, some of them intertwining, such as with the Ilea love theme and V'ger's. The film is so immersed in music and one becomes quickly familiar with all the motifs. A film composer's delight is when there are extended scenes with little or no dialogue, where he is free to fully materialize musical ideas and not worry so much about constraining the score to fit one point of action to another. Goldsmith delivered several exquisite musical interludes for the scenes entering the cloud and exploring the surface of V'ger. Because Jerry Goldsmith had such a difficult time working on this score, it turned out to be arguably his best, and I'd even venture to say one of the greatest film scores ever written.
Despite its lukewarm reception upon initial release, Star Trek the Motion Picture has definitely stood the test of time over the years. Its pacing might be alienating to some, but with its epic scope, unforgettable characters, truly magnificent score, and timeless and thought-provoking themes, the film remains a fantastic entry in the Star Trek franchise, and an excellent example of science fiction cinema in general. Plus, its release brought Star Trek back into the public consciousness, paving the way for the series to continue into some of its most celebrated moments. And despite its stigma, a lot of people do love the film, ourselves most definitely included.
If you haven't sought out Star Trek the Motion Picture because of bad word of mouth, I definitely recommend checking it out.
And if you're a big fan of it like we are, don't worry, you're not alone.
So until next time, this is Alex Latanzi,
And I'm Joel Davidson saying,
the human adventure is just beginning.
I think Flash Gordon in the comic strips, I particularly loved the, for those days, semi-nude women. They were so gorgeous. Wow.